Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, former South African President Jacob Zuma pleads not guilty in court to charges of corruption, fraud, racketeering and money laundering. South Africans have been waiting for him to take the stand for nearly 16 years. Also, Mali's interim president and prime minister resign days after they were arrested and detained in the country's second coup in just 9 months. Also, French President Emmanuel Macron is due to arrive in the Rwandan capital this week for a visit that's meant to further reset relations between the countries. There is some hope from many Rwandans of an apology from France over its role in the 1996 genocide against the Tutsis. But first, decades after some of the first offences with which he is charged allegedly happened, former South African President Jacob Zuma appeared before court to face a host of corruption allegations. He's pled not guilty to accusations that he took more than 700 bribes from French company Thales in the decade before he took office as president. The charges relate to a €3 billion arms deal he signed with Thales back in 1999. Yinka Oyetade has more.
How do you plead to them?
I plead not guilty.
Former South African President Jacob Zuma denying charges of corruption, fraud, racketeering and money laundering. The accusations date back more than 2 decades. Prosecutors say Zuma, during his time as deputy president back in 1999, accepted annual payments of tens of thousands of dollars from French arms company Thales. This in exchange for protecting the firm from an investigation into a $2 billion deal. AJ Zuklal worked as a lawyer for Thales 6 years ago. He claims Pierre Moino, former head of the company's local subsidiary, played a key role in the alleged corruption scandal.
I was just an observer at that time when Mr. Moino passed all these monies, not only to Mr. Zuma, but he also paid for the services of the former Minister of Justice, Mr. Penuel Maduna, in a London hotel. That amount was 50,000 euros.
Zuklal is one of around 200 witnesses that will be called on by the prosecution to testify at the hearings. The defense argued that the prospects of a fair trial are at stake. They are demanding that State Prosecutor Billy Downer be recused.
There are facts and circumstances that give me a reasonable impression that Mr. Downer has conducted himself in this case in a manner that lacks the independence and impartiality that is necessary for a lawful prosecution.
Numerous supporters gathered outside the court Wednesday. For them, Zuma will always be the people's president, while his critics say his 9-year tenure was replete with fraud and misconduct. If convicted, Zuma faces 25 years in prison.
So the trial started, but not for long. Proceedings were adjourned on Wednesday and won't start up again until July the 19th. Sam Bradpeace was in court for us, and he tells us more about the request by Zuma's defence to have the prosecution attorney recused.
Both Jacob Zuma and Thales pleaded not guilty at the High Court in Pietermaritzburg today. Mr. Zuma's legal team actually taking things one step further. They called for the recusal of Billy Downer, that's the state prosecutor, on the grounds that in 2014, Mr. Downer had proposed, or deposed, I should say, an affidavit in a case which had been launched by the DA, that's a South African opposition party. Now, this case was also linked to charges of corruption that had been faced by Jacob Zuma in the past. These charges were ultimately dropped in 2009. Now, this, the defence team for Mr. Zuma say, is proof, evidence, that Downer is neither impartial nor independent. But critics will look at this and they'll say that this really is just a delaying tactic. This is an excuse to kick this trial further down the road, and to some extent they're probably right. The court today was adjourned after a fairly short session. This is the second time that this trial has been adjourned, and it won't be until July that proceedings begin once again. This is to allow the South African state to analyse and consider the special plea for Downer's recusal made by Zuma's legal team.
At least 2 people were killed in Burundi after several grenades were thrown at various sites in Bujumbura. Authorities claim that arrests have been made and that an investigation is underway. Nicholas Chamat tells us more.
Journalists were able to film these bloodstains on the pavement before Burundian authorities said they didn't want the media shooting the sites of the grenade attacks in Bujumbura. Such attacks had not occurred in the economic capital in several years.
ukumva haje ibintu ngo barabarigisa n'amagerenade n'ukuri birababaje kandi birababaje cyane twaraye dushavuye bimwe tutagira ukuntu twobyumva bimwe tutugira uko twobigira n'ukuri ibintu birateye isoni.
No one has yet claimed responsibility for these attacks, but the government said they were carried out by terrorists.
Le bilan provisoire enregistré jusqu'à présent fait état de 2 morts, 57 blessés, dont 4 gravement. Un des terroristes blessé par sa grenade a été appréhendé et les enquêtes sont en cours sur son identité, le mobile, les tenants et les aboutissants de ces actes terroristes.
Burundi's opposition called for a swift investigation.
Si enquête il doit y avoir aussi résultat. Il ne suffit pas qu'on nous annonce qu'on enclenche une enquête. Il faut aussi nous dire l'évolution de l'enquête et même le dénouement de l'enquête. Sinon, ça serait plutôt jeter de la poudre aux yeux.
Some analysts believe the aim of the attacks was to show that the country is unstable. They took place just as Burundi is hosting a UN meeting on security in Central Africa for the first time since a coup attempt in 2015. Already earlier this month, another attack by an unidentified armed group had left 12 people dead in central Burundi.
The eastern Congolese city of Goma continues to suffer aftershocks from the volcanic eruption that happened over the weekend and left at least 31 dead and over 20,000 people homeless. Tremors were felt throughout the night into Wednesday, and 2 powerful shocks caused panic amongst those still in the city. The UN's temporarily relocating about half its humanitarian staff. Buildings have continued to collapse and huge cracks have opened up in the ground. Aftershocks have also been felt over the border in the Rwandan city of Gisenyi. Mali's interim president and prime minister resigned on Wednesday, days after they were arrested and detained in the country's second coup in just 9 months. President Ba Indao and Prime Minister Mokhtar Wan were leading a transitional government that took over after the military forced former President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta from power last August. The country's vice president, Colonel Assimi Goïta, has taken the reins once more. He also led the military junta that ousted President Boubacar Keïta last year. So for more on this, I'm joined by Professor Douglas Yates. Douglas, thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you.
Now, first of all, do you think that the fact that Indao and Wan formally resigned on Wednesday in any way changes what was set in motion by their detention on Monday?
Yeah, I do, because the perception of what's happened legally, the thin veneer of legitimacy has been given to this coup. Because if they've resigned, then they weren't ousted by the military. And that will allow something like return to normal for the colonels who are really running the show. I think the big news this week was now we really know who's the man in charge of Mali. We can spot him by name. We can see his image, and everything will therefore hinge on what he does as of this point.
So you're talking about Colonel Goïta there. He's actually promised, so there's been a lot of international backlash against the ousting of Indao, and call for them to be released. And however, Goïta's promised to stick to the election schedule, despite all the threats of sanctions that have come from, let's say, the US and the EU. Do you think if he does do that, that might see all the criticism we're seeing at the moment kind of die down a bit?
Yeah, I think they did the right thing to threaten targeted sanctions, but I don't think they will actually want to carry those out. Their interest will be to wait, to look, to see whether or not he finishes the last 9 months of this transition and holds an election. He was involved in the previous coup before, in 2012, which also then was a transitional military regime which allowed Ibeka to come into power. So he has already a track record of doing a holding operation. However, over the next few months, if we see that he takes off his uniform and presents himself as a candidate in the upcoming elections, then at that point we might be looking at a scenario that resembles Chad and Idris Deby. One thing's sure, France and Europe are heavily invested in the war on terror, and they need a partner in Bamako. And it was clear that the civilians that were in control were breaking the charter with the colonels who have real power. So now we'll see.
Thanks so much, Douglas Yates, giving us a bit of an insight into some of the influences that led to the ousting of Ndao earlier this week and his resignation on Wednesday. Now, French President Emmanuel Macron will arrive in the Rwandan capital of Kigali on Thursday for a highly anticipated visit. He'll be visiting the Genocide Memorial and hold talks with President Paul Kagame. The trip comes as France and Rwanda try to normalize relations after the publication of the Duclair report, which examined France's responsibility in the Rwandan genocide in 1996. Rwandans have high expectations as Macron comes, and there is some hope of an official apology.
At the Genocide Memorial in Kigali, France is presented as having played an active role in training and arming the armed groups that perpetrated the genocide. It's also the venue where French President Emmanuel Macron is expected to make his speech.
This visit is important. It's an important moment in history. At a certain point, you have to revisit the past. Preventing genocide is not something we Rwandans will be able to do alone. We need everyone. We need other states. We need France.
Senator André Twahirwa is with the ruling RPF party. He says the normalization of relations between Paris and Kigali will help both countries, and that this rapprochement was made possible because Emmanuel Macron and Paul Kagame share a political vision.
On both sides, we had two presidents, two heads of state who had the same vision, who saw far ahead. This is the end of an era of denial when people said, we deny everything, we did nothing. And it's the start of a new era of cooperation in all fields.
Those who escaped the genocide of the Tutsis are hoping for a strong signal from the French president.
He might be able to ask forgiveness on behalf of France, like the Belgian Prime Minister did, like the American President did. We are waiting for the French justice system to do its job and bring these dignitaries to justice as well.
According to the Rwandan prosecutor's office, of the 47 arrest warrants sent to France, only 3 suspects have been brought to justice.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks for joining us. Do so again if you can. Take care.